This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds, returning in 2025 to Chicago, Illinois this June and in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm Steve Usden, Washington editor of BioCentury. Today, I'm speaking with Michelle Rozo. Dr. Rozo is a vice president at In-Q-Tel, a nonprofit investor that supports the national security community, and she serves as vice chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, a congressionally chartered advisory body that's just released a report, really an action plan, charting the future of American biotechnology. That's what we're going to talk about today. But Dr. Rozo, I have to say to start with, your report, as I understand it, was completed in December, which seems like a different lifetime from now. You know, today, the foundations of American biotech seem to be faltering. A quarter of FDA staff has been laid off, fired, or quit since the 1st of February, creating huge regulatory uncertainty. NIH has been hit by layoffs and firings. The flow of science grants is being choked off, and it's a pretty grim situation out there for biotechs that need to raise capital. So I've got to ask to start with, are the recommendations in the report and its assessment of the situation relevant for the way that the world has changed in the last few months?
First of all, thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Look forward to the discussion today. Let me step back for a moment and just give a bit of an overview of who we are at the Commission and what we were asked to do. Biotech, and ultimately it's about getting biotech on the national stage and making sure that it's critical and clear to policymakers just how important biotechnology is. So as you mentioned, we are a legislative advisory board. We were created by Congress for Congress, and we are a group of subject matter experts, former government officials, and elected members of Congress, critically, who were asked by Congress to advise them on the intersection of emerging biotechnology and national security. And so we intentionally were broad with what national security means. It can mean economic security, food security, health security, energy security, supply chain security, and biotech, as your audience well knows, can relate to each of these areas that are critical for policymakers in Washington and for the American people. We were asked by Congress to look at where biotech is going and to make recommendations to Congress in advance of what we like to call the coming inflection point of this emerging technology so that Washington could be prepared, and particularly Congress, which is our constituency here, could be prepared and have the tools it needed in order to legislate around biotechnology. So, you know, as you say, we raise an alarm bell. Biotechnology is important for the United States, and we find that as we are reaching for this ChatGPT moment in biotechnology, which is coming, this sort of time frame when you can truly engineer biology in the way that we are getting closer to be able to do because of the intersection with artificial intelligence and automation and engineering biology tools. While we are trying to get there as quickly as we can here in the United States, we are seeing China race ahead in certain areas and outcompete us, what I like to refer to as the DeepSeek moment for those that are following the AI development.
So let's go there. You say that in the report that China is on the verge, really, of surpassing the United States in biotechnology, that there's a window for America to preserve its lead, but that's closing fast. You put it at 3 years. That tracks closely with statements from pharma leaders like Pfizer chairman Albert Bourla said something recently. It was quite similar to that. Can you elaborate on that? What are the signs that China is going to leap ahead of the United States? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm happy to dig further into this. And there's things we can point to quantitatively, and then there's also qualitative, assessments and discussions that we have. I should note that over the course of our work, we spoke with 1,800 members of the biotech community, both domestically and abroad in over 30 countries. And so our assessment is based on data, on qualitative discussions as well as quantitative metrics. And so if you look just at biopharmaceuticals, you are seeing China not just fast following, which I think is something that we have been tracking all along, being able to make medicines in the supply chain, but increasingly out innovating the United States in pharmaceuticals. And you see that by, the number of licensing deals, multinational companies searching out Chinese innovative biotech companies for intellectual property and licensing deals. You see the FDA approving 3 new drugs biomanufactured in China in 2023. And just the change in percentage of clinical trials launched by Chinese headquartered biopharmaceutical companies, the global share of Chinese pharmaceutical output, all of these indicators show that China is, in many cases, rapidly progressing their biopharmaceutical industry. And this, of course, is a stated goal of the CCP and of Xi Jinping, is to use biotechnology for economic and national security dominance.
And even to go further, what I've reported is news from FDA that 75% of the INDs filed in the last year in oncology were for Chinese companies. But your warnings go further than this. And I want to read you a quote from the report. You say that you warn about, quote, genetically enhanced Chinese super soldiers with fused human and artificial intelligence, and, quote, super soldiers with genetically enhanced physical capabilities. What's that about? Is that really something that Americans need to be afraid of today?
So look, we're not going to see super soldiers on the battlefield tomorrow, but there are military applications for biotechnology, just as there are military applications of emerging technologies in general. We need to be mindful of what those are in advance of seeing them on the battlefield and ensure that our policymakers can enact the tools and actions that they need to prevent against misuse, adversary use, weaponization in ways that could harm the United States and our service members.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with that. I do take issue with making these kinds of claims about super soldiers, and the report does it several times. Another thing the report says is, it asks a question, it says, what would it mean for world order if China developed biological means for dramatically extending human life or enhancing cognitive capabilities? And I wonder what you mean by that, and how would they do that in a way that was secret from us? I mean, most of the advances in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals are quite transparent certainly after they come on the market.
Steve, I think the main point that we're trying to make in the report, and it gets really at the heart of the matter, is that, look, technology is not inherently good or bad. Full stop. Biotechnology is not inherently good or bad, but it is who develops, deploys, and uses that technology that ultimately matters. And we lay out just how beneficial biotechnology could be if in the right hands. And again, I think your audience well knows in the pharmaceutical lane just how important biotechnology has been in the creation of drugs and products that have dramatically improved American lives, reduced mortality, and what is on the horizon with the rise of personalized medicine and gene therapies and cell therapies and all of these technologies. But as you know, and our lens was broader than just medicine, it's food and what we feed our people, right? And the potential to create crops that are more yield more product and can withstand weather environments. So the ability to feed our people, the food security that's so important, the ability to manufacture products here in the United States, of which we currently rely on sole source or foreign source, by reimagining our supply chains with biomanufacturing. So there is this immense potential for good if biotechnology used in the right way, but there is also an immense potential for bad. And again, this is not unique to biology. Technologies can be used in good or bad ways, but it gets to the heart of why we feel so strongly about this, that the United States must remain in the lead in this critical technology. And we lay out a suite of recommendations that would enable the United States to do that.
So moving on to the second kind of leg of it, after the warning about the concerns about China, is you advocate slowing down Chinese progress. How can the U.S. do that, and why would we want to do it? How would we want to do it?
So we lay out a series of recommendations, about 50 in total, of which half fit in the camp of running faster, right, of making the U.S. the most robust biotech sector in the world, and the other half is slowing China down. And that is because of the national security concerns that relate to adversaries' misuse of biotechnology. And so we lay out a number of ways to do that. And I should also note the non-market actions, what we refer to as brute force economics that Chinese companies and the Chinese government use in order to provide leading companies with cheap capital through government subsidies and investments that undercut American products. And again, with these non-market actions, are able to take IP that they have acquired from the United States, put them into Chinese companies, and get them to work, and undercut the U.S. competitors. And so we lay out a series of recommendations to blunt that, and happy to go into any that are of interest to you. But this includes looking at prohibiting companies that work with national security agencies and HHS from using certain Chinese biotechnology suppliers that pose a national security threat, reforming CFIUS to nimbly screen highest impact, highest risk types of investments in critical technology sectors. And I should say, and pause here, that many of our recommendations relate to biotechnology, but are not only about biotechnology. We see the similar playbook in action from the Chinese government with other critical technologies. So,
yeah, let's talk, because you mentioned two things, and the first one that you mentioned sounds a lot like the Biosecure Act that was debated in Congress last year and ultimately wasn't passed at the end of the year. And I note that the commission endorsed that bill last year. Is that what you're talking about, something like that?
As you say, I, along with fellow commissioners, did support the Biosecure Act. And so we look forward to working with Congress to help the drafters of that legislation move forward, should that be of interest, and how we adapt those types of provisions to ultimately get to the end goal, which is, again, to ensure that we are not having suppliers in our ecosystem that pose national security threats.
Do you think that something like Biosecure has legs, that it will be revived in the current Congress?
You'd have to speak to drafters of that legislation. But I think, as we've discussed, the threat of the Chinese industry in this sector is great. And we lay out a number of things, which we've already discussed today, of, how they are quickly ascending the gap in biotechnology dominance, the areas in which they are out innovating us, and we critically lay out some of the areas in which they are leveraging U.S. intellectual property, state champions, non-market actions in order to do that. And again, these pose national security threats.
So one of the sentences, I want to read something else from the report because it really struck me. It says, China does not have a right to American research, period. What does that mean? Are you talking about R&D from biopharmaceutical companies? Are you talking about academic research? Are you talking about cutting ties, for example, between NIH and China, or access that Chinese academics would have to American, databases, things like that? What's that about?
So we found, as we've gone through our work, our job was to articulate the risk of doing business with China in a number of different areas. And we've described various ways in which our biotech sector intersects with the Chinese sector. And that could be research collaborations, but it could also be large institutions in the United States that rely on Chinese suppliers for critical services, biotech services. It could be manufacturing, and we lay out a number of areas in which we have real dependence on Chinese suppliers of biomanufacturing for our pharmaceutical supply chain. Again, things that your audience,
absolutely, yeah,
as well as the raw materials in our supply chain. And it's not just the drugs that make up our medicines in our medicine cabinet, but it's also, the consumables, the pipettes, the gloves, the things that our biotech industry needs in order to work, and perform the tasks that they do every day. So in many ways, we've designed and laid out ways to mitigate that. We've talked about that. One of those options that we propose in our recommendations around, prohibiting companies that work with national security agencies in particular. So this is scoped, again, to national security agencies and HHS from using certain Chinese biotech suppliers, CFIUS reforms, also looking at directing ITC, the International Trade Commission, to investigate Chinese dumping or oversupply of biotech products as it surfaces, to really get a sense of how, Chinese firms may have been able to flood the market and acquire market control of critical industries like biotechnology. And so we lay out a number of recommendations to mitigate the risks that we see in the intersection of our biotech ecosystem with the Chinese from across the entire value chain.
So most of the things that you talk about now are around supply chain resiliency, and I don't think there's a lot of controversy to say that people believe that the supply chain should be far more resilient, and the United States shouldn't have single points of failure with any country. But the question I really asked was about research, and I'm wondering how far upstream you're going in your recommendation for cutting off access of Chinese scientists, for example, or Chinese companies to American research. And then on the flip side of that, thinking about American multinational companies that are conducting biopharmaceutical research in China.
Right. So again, we lay out, we articulate the risk of cooperating with China in these areas of the risk that poses to American businesses, to industry, and to the biotech ecosystem. In some areas, we lay out recommendations to mitigate that risk. In others, we lay out the risks that we see and the tools for policymakers and those that that are in charge of making those decisions to take the advice that we give and implement that in their efforts that they carry out in their work. So we've described some of the areas in which we lay out specific options to mitigate, and then in other areas we describe the risks and saw that as our job to Congress was to be able to describe the risks that we're seeing again across the entire value chain.
Well, we're gonna take a quick break now, and when we come back, we're getting to the more fun part, which is talking about what the recommendations that you've got for bolstering and for enhancing American biotechnology. We'll be back in just a moment.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the U.S. and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds U.S. and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
So let's talk about the things that the Commission has recommended for bolstering American biotechnology.
Yeah.
The Commission, here's again quoting from the report, the Commission's main recommendation is this: the U.S. government should dedicate a minimum of $15 billion over the next 5 years to unleash more private capital into our national biotechnology sector. Can you talk about that? What would that $15 billion go to? What would it do?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. This is again the heart of our work, and so it is spread across a multitude of departments and agencies. But ultimately, the goal is to create again the most robust biotech sector in the world and be able to solve for some of the gaps that we saw in our system. So we took a look over the last 2 years at the perennial strengths that we have in biotechnology, things like our research and development ecosystem, like our markets, and the burgeoning biotech ecosystem of which supports and has leading edge technologies for all of the applications, again, medicine, agriculture, energy, food, and defense. And so we fail in many ways to commercialize the results of that innovation. So while, again, your listeners will know well, there is a well-established group of investors that support therapeutic products and have defined pathways to market for many products that are in the medical sector. When you look at products for agriculture, for industry, for energy or defense, there is much less attention by investors. And in many cases, they're not facing the same sort of defined pathways to market through regulatory pathways. And so we are seeing a system where we are not supporting all of the potential great applications of biotechnology, and some of our historic strengths are atrophying. So we lay out recommendations to address that, and the $15 billion is spread across everything from research to market. And the goal of this is to make ultimately to change the paradigm where biotech still takes too long and it's too expensive to get these R&D capabilities out of the lab and into the market. And this is not unique to to non-pharmaceutical products. We want pharma to get quicker and cheaper as well, but the return potential on the other end makes that pathway attractive for pharmaceuticals in a way that it does not for the other areas. And so we lay out ways that the targeted, specific strategic actions that the U.S. government can take in order to get the private sector to play for all of the diverse applications of biotechnology. That looks like
I'm sorry, just to interrupt. So you're talking about 15 billion, it's $5 billion a year for $3 billion a year for 5 years. By comparison, in December, just one deal, Novo Nordisk paid $16.5 billion in cash for a contract manufacturer. So when we're looking at, in the National Cancer Institute's annual budget's $7 billion. So when we're looking at it, on the one hand, $15 billion in this environment seems like an awful big ask for Congress. On the other hand, is it enough to really move the needle? Or are we going to see a return on that that's commensurate with the kinds of problems that you're identifying?
Yeah, because we lay out this 15 billion across a series of areas, it's intended to be this tide that raises all boats. And so, for example, in the research arena, we looked at the areas that if we were able to solve them in the United States, we would be able to turn that flywheel we described to make the biotech quicker and cheaper and get to scale faster. So we have two grand research challenges we lay out. One is how to make biology predictably engineerable, and a number of tasks underneath that again, putting the brightest minds to work here in the United States can help make biology this field of design. The second grand research challenge is around scale up and around getting these products that are notoriously difficult, sometimes biology, right, to get to do what you want it to in a large scale environment, to change that paradigm, get to more flexible, continuous modes of manufacturing, standardized, and again, be able to do that all here in the United States. So by maximizing and cross-cutting capabilities across all of the diverse areas in which biotechnology can apply, the goal, again, is to be targeted and focused and really look at the areas that the government can come to play, but we surely anticipate the private sector coming in with capital as well once the government does things like become a better customer for some of these products, of which there is not a well-defined market today. Or I should add.
Yeah. So and one of the specifics that's in the report, you call for the creation of an independence investment fund.
That's right.
How large would the fund be? What would it do that VCs aren't doing now? Kind of what are the gaps that it would fill that investors aren't filling today?
Yeah. So we recommend that this Independence Investment Fund is capitalized just south of $1 billion. It would operate outside of the government in a VC-like fashion, but with a non-governmental manager. We recommend fencing off a portion of this fund for biotechnology, but we do not think it needs to be specific to biotechnology. Again, getting at what we were talking about earlier, that some of the challenges facing biotechnology for national security and defense applications are the same that we see in other technologies. And so what we're seeing is this valley of death that companies are facing as they try to traverse the lab to market pathway, specifically and predominantly where they're working on platform technologies that are for agriculture, energy, defense, health security, things, again, where there's not this well-defined investor class and a well-defined pathway to market and customers on the other end. So the goal of this Independence Investment Fund would be to signal to investors that these are areas that are of strategic importance to the U.S. government, and that with things like market commitments and other recommendations that we recommend, that there are willing customers on the other end to absorb some of the risk and preserve the reward for the private sector to come to play for all of these diverse applications of biotechnology.
So presumably this fund would be run something like a traditional venture fund, but it would have different goals and different governance structure.
Yeah, we lay out the objectives of the fund, and this is one of the areas we look forward to working with Congress on how to design this and ultimately implement it.
So one of the other things that's in the report, and I think this is something really where there's a lot of alignment across the biopharma industry for sure, is the importance of increasing manufacturing in the United States, and not only in the United States, but you also say among allies of the United States. How are you going to make that happen?
So a couple of ways. We look at at seeing companies today that are leaving the United States to do their manufacturing. They're performing their scale up abroad. And we're looking at companies that in the industrial space, when they have to go through different phases of scale up in order to prove out their product, these sort of accessible pre-commercial facilities that exist elsewhere in the world do not exist in the United States. These are what we're calling pilot scale facilities. And so we recommend the creation of pre-commercial, in this case, bioindustrial facilities to support product scale up here in the U.S. On the pharmaceutical side, companies can face a disincentive to innovate their manufacturing methods, especially once a chosen method has been approved by regulators. And so we recommend a public-private biopharmaceutical manufacturing center of excellence focused on developing new ways of scaling medicines, and do that with regulators so that you're working hand in hand. This is accessible. It works across companies, academics, government scientists, regulators to improve and innovate in biopharmaceutical manufacturing. And so the key here is we're talking about pre-commercial manufacturing facilities that can innovate around the scale up of biomanufacturing, because we have not yet optimized for that. We're still, it still takes too long and it's too complex to manufacture these products. You look at cell and gene therapies, which one of the reasons that access is limited is because it is too complex to manufacture some of these products.
Absolutely, yeah.
We lay out, again, with these facilities and with the research challenges, a complementary approach to attempt to address that, and do so again here in the United States.
So what kind of scale of investment are you looking at to improve biomanufacturing and, across the board or in particular sectors? I imagine, we're talking first, you mentioned cell and gene therapies. That's, tremendous need there. Synthetic biology could be used for any number of improving any number of industrial sectors across America. What's the kind of scale of investment that you're thinking of putting in there?
So, as you said earlier, our suite of recommendations is $15 billion over 5. That includes everything we've talked about. So the R&D, the manufacturing facilities, the market commitments, the independent investment fund. All of those are costed out in the report. I encourage the listeners to go and take a look, but we have line items for everything that we recommend and costs that we anticipate these items will cost. And again, are working with Congress on these proposals, on getting these introduced. And critically, we have 18 months. We released the report yesterday, but we're not done now. We have a period of time in which to focus on getting these things through Congress and getting these things enacted into law, which is, I'd like to say that we're basically at phase 1 of our work. Phase 2 now starts, and that's these things actually accomplished.
And so one other critical element, I think, about manufacturing, especially, and you highlight it in your report, and I think it's really important, which is having a trained workforce. It's kind of a chicken and an egg problem, right? If you have manufacturing facilities and you don't have a workforce that's trained to use them, then you can't make them run. If you have people who are trained and they don't have anywhere to work, then they're going to go and do something else. How do you think about putting that together, and syncing it so that you can have a trained workforce that's ready, and there are jobs for them, and we can create some of these capabilities in the United States that we don't have today?
Yeah. Thank you for raising this, as we close out here, because this is of critical importance to the work. I mean, ultimately, this is the exciting thing about biotechnology in the future, right? Is it will grow more jobs across America, and these are good jobs, manufacturing jobs across the whole country, not isolated to certain pockets and areas. And importantly, what we found is that supply has not caught up with demand. So there is more demand for jobs in the biotech sector, in manufacturing, in computational and AI-driven jobs than there are people to fill it. And so we look at the role that the federal government can take in supporting the development of new jobs and new workforce, things like standardizing credentials so that they transfer more seamlessly, things like training those workforce in those facilities that we talked about, in these pre-commercial facilities, maximizing the use of the manufacturing hubs that are already spread across the country, these public-private partnerships, but their reach is limited. And so we have a series of recommendations around maximizing the impact of those facilities, of those workforce training programs, standardizing that, and then looking at high school and getting this sort of next generation of workforce into careers, and an NSF grant program that supports student to career pathways in biotechnology, a service scholarship for service program, and a biotechnology for all high school students initiative with a grant program and a consortium to advance secondary education. So really looking at how we fill the demand that is there for these jobs in the next few years, where it's going to be so critical to get people into these roles, into these good jobs here in America. Well,
great. Thank you. As you said, we are kind of coming to the end of our time, but I really appreciate your taking the time to speak with me, and I'll certainly be watching closely to see how the recommendations that you've made, that the commission has made, get translated into policy and legislation.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds, returning in 2025 to Chicago, Illinois this June and in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.